Hello, I am that Rob Human, and this is part 1 of my Tabletop Playground mod development series, in where we set up our first workspace. But first, we're going to make some changes to the initial configuration of Tabletop Playground. Namely, we're going to change some cursor modes, the object highlight, and unbind. I'll walk you through on how to do this. First, this is pretty much a brand new install of Tabletop Playground. I mean, I've got my subscribed mods, sure, but I have nothing in the editor, and the settings have already been changed that I would be making. But first, I'm going to go to the Game tab, and I'm going to change the cursor style from what would normally be 3D, the default, to screen. This changes how you interact with the objects in your game, and I would recommend these changes for both developers and players, by the way. Screen in particular I feel is a little bit more intuitive. A couple things that it does is it lets you slide other objects underneath overhanging objects. The 3D cursor doesn't let you do that so well, and the click and drag box, the selection box, is different for screen, and I think it's a little more intuitive that way. I leave it to you, but I think it's worth at least giving this a go. The next change I would make is object highlight style. I would change this from light up object to outline. For large objects or lots of little objects that are nearby each other, I find the light up object to be a little too glaring. Outline is a little more subtle and it less flashy. Just a little easier on my retinas personally. And the last change that I would recommend making is to actually unbind the reset held objects. And the reason for this is normally it's R. So if you pick up an object in the world and you hit R, it will make you let go of the object and put it back where it was before you picked it up, which is great. But the problem is that it actually conflicts with the object action. And so when you're hovering your mouse over an object that is on the table and you hit R, say for a card, or better yet a die, it will actually roll that die, or it'll do some action. If you pick it up and hold it and hit R, it will reset and do that object action. Now, in some cases, that object action won't have an effect when it's being held, but if your object has any kind of custom primary action or anything like that, it will actually resolve both of those effects. So it'll reset and perform the primary action, which I think is actually a bit of a problem. So I always unbind the reset held objects because I don't really use it that much. You could change it to something else, but I just unbind it. The point is that it conflicts with the primary action, and I find that really annoying. So I always close that out. I always change that up. So we're back to our initial state here. Anyways, so we're going to set up our workspace here for our new mod. And there are two ways to do it. There's the easy way and the complex way. The easy way is, well, easy. There's no external or extra tooling that you'll need, and it's exactly what Tabletop Playground kind of expects people to do out of the box. It's fairly simple, but it comes with some cons. For one, it makes it a little bit harder to collaborate on. It also is pretty tightly coupled to where you've installed Tabletop Playground, which might be a problem or might not. For myself, Tabletop Playground is installed by way of Steam, so the program files are buried in my program files /Steam /Steam apps /common and it's just, I'll show you the path in a minute, but it's all the way down there, and it's kind of annoying. And the other thing is, it exists on the file system, which means there's no way to control versioning. If I have a development version that I'm currently iterating, I can't have that sit next to my production version, which is what's actually released to the public. So if you're iterating on your mod, that can actually be a detriment. Option 2 is the complex way, which I will be showing you both, by the way. The pro of this is obviously like I said, version control is a thing, but first of all, collaboration is easier, and we'll get into that when we start sharing our package via Git or GitHub. The workspace can also be decoupled from the file system a little bit, which is to say that, in my setup, I'm going to have the workspace that we'll be working on my D drive, completely different drive, but Tabletop Playground won't actually care. You can also do some transpilation, which, for those of you who are familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript and whatnot, this is a good way to do that. For those who aren't familiar, basically it lets you do more advanced scripting and have better tooling to take advantage of the broader scripting ecosystem as it applies to JavaScript and TypeScript. And I'll be diving into that in a future episode in this series, but this complex way of setting up a workspace can actually be of huge benefit when you're getting into that. As I hinted at before, another pro of this is version control. It becomes significantly easier not only to have forks in your development, so if you're working on a particular feature, kind of like you would in a code base, you can branch your Git or whatnot, but even if you're not going to leverage a Git repository for your code, this complex way has two different things, which is the dev-prod parallelism that I mentioned just below that, which is this workspace lets you have not only a development version of your project, but it also lets you keep a production version of your project separately. So that way you can iterate, do rapid iteration on your dev version, but keep production totally separate. There's more complex ways to do that a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit when we get into, leveraging GitHub and Git repositories a little bit, which is totally optional. The con of that is that, the complex way is more complex. It takes a little bit more work to set up and takes a little bit of technical know-how on how to do. I'm going to do my best to walk you through on how this happens, but, you'd probably be a little bit more familiar with this if you're a power user of Windows or whatever operating system you're on. I'm on Windows, by the way, so these steps might be a little bit different depending on your operating system. It's not too bad, but it is not, you're not clicking a button. Speaking of which, the easy way. Let's go through that right now. The easy way, you do right in Tabletop Playground. You go to the editor, you say create a new package, and this is easy package. And there you go. You have a package. If I go back, there's the easy package. Edit selected package, and you can hit this little folder button up here, and that actually opens up the templates folder within your package. And this is the package as it exists right now. It's completely empty, but it's there. And this is the folder I was talking about before, where it's tightly coupled to what TTPG wants. This is that directory, C, program files, Steam apps, common, and this is where all your mods in development that exist on your hard drive that you don't download from mod.io live. So you're going to be working in this directory when you go to add assets and whatnot. You can do some importing and whatnot, and Tabletop Playground leverages that, but I've always found it really annoying that my mod lives here instead of where I want it to live. But that's the easy way. You now have a mod you can start working on. So let's get into the complex way. Like I said, the complex way, does a couple things differently, and so we don't necessarily have to work in that Steam apps directory anymore. However, it does come with some external tool requirements. For one, you're going to need VS Code, or some other IDE if you're not a fan of VS Code. I'm going to be using VS Code, so that's what I'm going to recommend. You'll also need Node.js. which is a JavaScript runtime environment. Kind of like a browser without the browser. You run JavaScript in it as though it were a browser, but it's not actually a browser. It's a little more nuanced than that, but that's the gist of it. It's worth noting, though, that if you're going to be getting into any kind of complex scripting, you're probably already going to have or going to need VS Code and Node.js, even if you're not setting up your workspace this way. So chances are you're going to run into needing VS Code or some other IDE and Node.js anyways. The third requirement there is Yarn. Yarn is a package manager for Node.js. And by package manager, I mean it literally manages your packages for you. Node.js ships with a particular package manager called, believe it or not, Node Package Manager, or NPM. Yarn is another one. It's an alternative to it. So there is another one as well, which is what I actually use, called PNPM, which is a great name, but, you know. The reason why you're going to need Yarn specifically, you don't have to use it in your workspace. In fact, I'm probably going to end up using PNPM because that's what I like and what I'm used to. You're still going to need Yarn installed, and that's because of the tooling that I've created that sets up the workspace. Yarn is a requirement of that even if you don't actively use it in your workspace. Kind of a weird thing, but you're going to need it. So to get those, I'm going to have links in all the usual places that people put links for these kinds of tutorials. VS Code can be found here. You just download and install it. Node, likewise, here. You can go for the current version. That'll be fine. To install Yarn, it's a bit more complicated. You'll already need to have Node.js installed, and you'll just run this on the command line, and I'll totally show you how to do that in just a minute. But these are the packages that you'll need in order to start on the thing. Once you have VS Code and Node.js, and not yet Yarn, but soon, installed, we're going to run a command line interface, or a command line for you. Again, I use Windows, so your experience here might be slightly different. I'm also going to assume that for now you're going to use Yarn since you just downloaded it, or will have downloaded it by the time you get here. So that's why this next command line does that. But I'm going to go to a certain directory, and again, this is on my D drive. This is not anywhere close to where ttpg lives. I'm going to hold down Shift and right click, and I'm going to open PowerShell here. Now first, let me Alt Tab over to here, and we're just going to slide this over. If you don't have Yarn installed, just run this command right there. Can I paste it? Come on. There we go. Now I've already got Yarn installed, so I'm not going to need to run this, but just paste that in there, hit enter, you should be good to go. Again, you're not necessarily required to use Yarn to do it. Like I said, I'm going to use PNPM, or at least typically that's what I'll do. I might just use Yarn for the sake of simplicity here, but you'll then have Yarn installed. Now, at that point, you're going to run this in that same command line interface. Yarn create ttpg-package, the name of your package, which in this case is going to be ttpg-tutorial-series, and this little double, what's called a switch, or an extra parameter kind of thing, --template space tsx. And as I'm typing this, ttpg tutorial series template tsx. Now this template parameter can be one of three things. It can be JS or JavaScript, it can be TS or TypeScript, or TSX, which is, well, TSX. If you're familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript and all that, you probably already know what this is, except perhaps TSX. essentially there's 3 different versions of create ttpg-package. It kind of sets you up in an initial state, used as a template. For the sake of this series, I'm going to be using the TSX one, because I figure we'll be using TypeScript, and the TSX one is TypeScript plus an additional thing, and we'll be using that additional thing later in the series. So I'm going to be using template TSX. You don't necessarily have to, but if you're new to all this, I would recommend, or if you're new to all this, or if you're just following along, I would recommend using that template TSX. So I'm going to hit enter. It's going to do some stuff, and it's going to ask us a bunch of questions. We need a name for our package. We're going to call this ttpg tutorial series. Cool. Now, provide a production GUID for your package, or hit enter to use the provided value. The provided value is fine. It's randomly generated, and the only requirement for a GUID is that it needs to be unique, and GUIDs are pretty much guaranteed to be unique if they're randomly generated. It's a complicated thing I'm not going to get into. The defaults are fine. Same with the development version. There are 2 GUIDs for this setup. We'll get into why in a little bit. The next thing is, where is that package directory? This is the package, this is the directory that TTPG wants stuff to be in. And the workspace asks that so it can kind of copy stuff a little bit. It's complicated, but you'll just need to enter it in. The default is the program's best guess. If you've installed your Tabletop Playground directory elsewhere, it might be somewhat different. Again, I kind of assume that you're using Steam. It might be different for the Epic install. I'm not entirely sure. It might be different for your operating system. Like I said, it takes its best guess. If it's wrong, you can change it later, or you can enter in the directory here and now. I happen to know that the default is fine. And then a version number. This workspace assumes that you use semantic versioning. You can read up on semantic versioning, or semver, all across the internet. It's really popular in the JavaScript community, the ecosystem, and elsewhere in the coding space. Essentially, it's just an easier way to track version numbers internally, or even externally, past, like, oh, this is version 1, this is version 2, version 3. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It assumes 001 is your starting state. That's fine. So I'll just hit enter to do its thing. It's going to run a bunch of stuff, and there we go. We now have a folder called ttpg tutorial series in our directory. And there it is. So I'm now going to change directory into it, and I'm going to run code, which is VS Code. This is VS Code. I'm not going to cover how to use VS Code all that much. You can look around. There are plenty of tutorials that are really good at explaining how to use VS Code more effectively than I can ever do it. But to begin with, all you're going to need is just open up a terminal inside of VS Code. And to do that, I use Control tilde. Not sure what the Mac keystroke is there. And all we're going to do is just do yarn dev. It's going to do a couple things, and there you go. Now what this does is essentially sets up a development version of your mod all laid out so that TTPG can access it. If I go back to here, this is the Tabletop Playground directory. We have our ttpg tutorial series _dev, which is significant, right here. And it's got a little arrow. That's because it's not actually there. It's actually all here. More precisely, it's actually this folder here. It's something called a symlink. Symbolic link, I think, is what that's short for. Essentially, it fools the file system into thinking that this folder is actually here, but it's over there, and it just kind of links it. So Tabletop Playground will be like, oh yeah, this folder's over here. Cool, I can access it. Except it's actually over here. It fools Tabletop Playground into thinking that it's there. In fact, if I come back out to the main menu and go into the editor, there it is. There's our dev package. It's there. It's all good to go. But going back to VS Code, we have our assets directory, and this can be, where you keep your textures and models and your templates that TTPG will create as you create objects from within the game. That's fine. It also has your source directory from where you can run all your stuff. And I think, did it actually? It did. Okay. We'll get into that in a little bit, particularly when we get into scripting. But so we have this workspace set up, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of things when it comes to the workspace life cycle, for lack of a better term. Essentially, what are the different commands that you'll need to run, or should run, to accomplish what you want to do. We already experimented with one already, which is that dev command. You can actually also run them using this little npm scripts up here. Just hit dev, and it'll take care of it. Another thing we might want to do, I'm just going to back out here a little bit. We might want to clean it. What cleaning does is it removes your dev version from Tabletop Playground, non-destructively. Which is to say, if I hit clean, it's gone from Tabletop Playground's directory. Tabletop Playground can no longer see it. It's removed. But your actual mod is safe and sound. It's all right here, elsewhere. It just breaks the link. So Tabletop Playground won't see it, but it still exists. This is what I mean about that tightly coupling. It doesn't have to exist in the persistent download dir anymore. So we're going to close that now that we've cleaned it. A couple other things that we're going to do is we're going to run that dev again. And that basically rebuilds the development workspace. And again, it is now linked. Now let's say that you've done, you've created your mod, you've added all your templates and your textures and models and whatnot, and you're ready to ship it. Well, to do that, what we can do is do yarn build, or run the build script. Now what this does is it basically takes your mod and creates a self-contained version of the mod that you can then upload from Tabletop Playground. This is your production version. This is, stuff that happens over here is no longer coupled to this version of the mod. It stands on its own. This is the version that you would want to publish from within Tabletop Playground. So, for example, I gotta come back out because the editor refreshes its list when you exit, not when you enter. It's weird. Anyways, there's our production version of the mod. You can then, edit selected mod and upload package. You can then put this on mod.io, what have you. Obviously I'm not going to because it's empty, but that's the thing. After you publish your mod, what you probably want to do is actually run another script called post-publish. Now, it did actually give us a warning, but when you publish a mod to mod.io, something in the manifest will actually change. If I actually open up this manifest JSON. Actually, you know what? There it is. This is the manifest that Tabletop Playground will actually pick up. There's the GUID, the name of the mod, and this happens even on the easy workspace version. When you upload to mod.io, Tabletop Playground will actually inject an ID to it so that it knows where am I uploading this mod to. It's kind of what prevents it from uploading the same mod twice. It also will throw in a thumbnail, the thumbnail that you give it when you go to upload. It'll throw that into the same directory. The post-publish script will actually update your workspace to know, oh yeah, this is the mod ID that got uploaded. Now I remember it. Additionally, it'll also take any thumbnail that's there and copy it here so that you can, regenerate it when you go to build it again. So now, for a minute, let's assume that you've already published the mod and you've got your development version and your build version, your production version, sitting in your directory side by side, right? You've got this. Now let's say that you've done some iteration on the development version and you're ready to release another production build. Well, to do that, first what I'm going to do is do yarn purge. Yarn purge will remove the production version of your mod from Tabletop Playground. It'll actually delete it. And that's okay, that's to be expected. So I'm going to hit yarn purge. It will ask you, are you sure you want to do that? Hit yes. And again, it'll ask, hey, if you publish this, that means, I need the mod.io and the thumbnail, or the mod.io ID and the thumbnail. If it's there, do you want me to grab it before I actually purge this? I was like, sure. At which point, I didn't publish it, so the mod.id isn't there, but now your production version is gone, which means you can now rebuild it using yarn build to now take your dev version, or version that you've updated and ready to update, do a build, and there it is again. At which point you can now re-upload it to mod.io and it will update the mod that's there. So that's kind of like the development life cycle, I guess you could call it, of this mod. So one of the things that I touched on as a pro of this is collaboration. Well, one of the great things about this is because you've got your workspace elsewhere, sure, you could copy it and send it to someone and it'll have everything there, but this, first off, this node modules directory can get kind of large, and also you might not necessarily need to actually give them two versions of this. So one of the things that I've set up in this workspace as part of the create ttpg-package command line is it's ready to actually get hosted on a Git repository, such as GitHub. So let's say I've built out this workspace and I'm preparing to set it up so that other people can work on it. I've got more than one developer working on this game and this mod, and well, now I want to be able to let them get it. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-P and type in GitHub. So I can publish this to GitHub. And I'm going to put this as a public directory. Now you might need to link up your GitHub ID or whatnot. You could also do this the old-fashioned way where you create the Git repository on GitHub and do that. I'm not going to go too deep into what, establishing a Git repository. There are plenty of tutorials out there. The point is, it's really easy to collaborate with other people on this mod now, because all they have to do, and I'm just going to go to my GitHub account here. GitHub. Remind me later. Yes, I know. I really will do that. No, really. There we go. So people could actually come here and clone this repository. Or if you have it set up as a private repo, you could do that and share this git clone link to other places. So in the next series, I'll actually start with cloning this repository. You'll be able to skip that part if you are just working on this solo, but just to have a living example of what this is like, I will start the next episode with cloning an existing repository so that you know what that's like. Additionally, as I progress this series, I'm actually going to keep this repository up to date, and I'll branch the different episodes and whatnot In fact, let me do that right now. Git checkout branch part 1. Git push cool. So now if I refresh this, there's actually 2 branches. Main will always be up to date, but at the end of every episode I will branch part 1, part 2, etc., so that you can see where they are incrementally. If you're experienced with Git, you'll know how this works. If not, let me know and I can document that a little bit better. But there is the basics of setting up your workspace. In the next episode, we will go into actually creating some objects and leveraging this workspace a little bit better. Yarn purge, yes. Cool. Just gonna close that out. Just so that we don't have the production build hanging over our head. But yeah, we'll be able to actually start creating some objects and getting into the weeds a little bit about what these are, what you'll need to set them up, and how they behave in game. That'll be the next episode. So until then, take care.